Talking God with Uncle Luke. This week, art, imagination, and us. Come on in, let's check it out. Acts chapter 17, verse 10 to 34.
All the bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical channel. Always glad somebody is showing up because, well, this is where Bubba and Biblical meet up. And to all the Bubbas of the world, we just want to get people reading their Bible, saying their prayers, get together, talking God. We want to move people away from the bullshit to the holy shit so that we can shoot the shit and maybe sound like we know our shit. To have a little bit of fun talking God and getting into the Bible itself and to get the great benefit of these stories and get the great benefit of the information that comes out of them. And, well, really, as God's will is, we should be rejoicing always, praying continually, and giving thanks in all circumstances because this story is just that great. It's totally awesome. And it will never let anybody down. The old idea of infallible is what the Bible is, and that is it will not fail. It will not fall down. It will hold you up, and it will be the life-giving source that it promises to be because it is God behind it. Okay, without any further chitty chat and all of that, let's move in. It's Acts chapter 17, verse 10 to 17, verse 34. So it's a shorter passage. We'll kind of walk down through the passage and the logic of that passage, and then we'll stop, pause, and hone in on something that Uncle Luke tells us that Uncle Paul says. So let's just remember that before this scene, before this little section here, what had happened is there's a huge development, and that is that as the news is being preached and taught about Jesus Christ, who has died and risen again, and his apostles and disciples, both men and women, are getting out in the countryside. They are moving about the Greco Roman world. They're coming to this, they came to this startling conclusion that the Greeks and the Gentiles are all in on this. The Jews are struggling. But the Greeks and the Gentiles aren't struggling as much. And so that raises this huge kerfuffle. And the Jews who are, the base, remember all the apostles, all the disciples, all the, first, believers that there ever were all Jewish. And the big head scratch is, what do we do with all these Greeks, all these Gentile believers, these, people that are outside the community of the chosen people? And the conclusion is, well, we don't do anything with them. We don't have to make them Jewish. And that was the big head scratch. Shouldn't we make them Jewish? Shouldn't they do what Jews do? And the answer is no. Jesus made it clear. Even God had made it clear throughout the pages of the scriptures that the traditions that God had given the Israelites, and the Israelites, had welled up even more traditions than that. But those traditions were never really the substance of the message. The real substance of the message is that God was going to bring his presence in a very powerful way to here on earth. And we find that in the person and the presence of Jesus Christ. And he too speaks of God in the present. And then he dies and he rises again, and that is the substance of the big message. And so the first group realized that, well, we cannot attach any strings to this. This is joy for the whole entire world. This is joy for the whole entire planet, man. Kind of like, the old Three Dog Night Band used to sing, Jeremiah was a bullfrog, he was a good friend of mine, joy to the world. So that song is echoing, in the background of as the apostles and the group is trying to make some serious decisions. They're saying, well, we got to make sure that this message is exactly what it is. It is joy to the world. It is great news. It is good news. And so we're not going to put any strings attached to it, except, there is this conclusion that, the Gentiles and the Greeks need to get away from these temples. Now, we covered that in our last talk. If you want to jump back and check that out, please do. But, the idea that is concluded on is that the one thing we got to tell Greeks and Gentiles is that their temples are not, compatible with what God is doing in the person of Jesus Christ. And in those temples, the modern person needs to understand these temples were not the cute, pleasant places that we like to go visit, and think of as maybe, church in a different way. That wasn't, the temples were strange. They were weird, especially to the modern. If you showed up in the modern, if a modern person showed up in these temples, they would find it to be horrifying, I think. First of all, there are idols all over the place, and that is just not compatible with the message of God. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But also, there was sex going on in these temples. Very common to have, sex going on in these temples, because really I'll talk about it I've talked about it in other places, but just know that the temples were a very sexual place. Prostitution, as we would call it, is what the temples were going on. And there was some reasons behind that, but it's a call off to all things temple, and also to strangulation and to blood. That, in these temples, man, there was some strange rituals, strangulations, blood, sex, idols. And so the declaration is made that that's the only hindrance that we're putting on the Gentiles. They got to get rid of this temple stuff. So all of that stuff. And again, we talked about this last week, but that is a prohibition, but that's a prohibition for anybody, because this news is so good. You can't just mix it in with that kind of stuff. That's crazy. And so anywho, the development that comes next is not only, so the apostles, are now getting out into the Greco Roman world. And a lot of what's going on is in what we call modern day Turkey. But as the apostles are now moving about and speaking to Greeks and Gentiles, Paul finds himself, well, let's just go to the storyline. So the first part of the story starts in Acts chapter 17, verse 10, where Paul heads off, with company. He goes with Silas over to Berea from Thessalonica. Again, modern day Turkey is kind of where we are, between Greece and Turkey, that's where the action is taking place. And so when they get to Berea, they find that the people in Berea, as Uncle Paul will say, are hearing us so much better, and they're doing exactly what they should do, that they are checking in with what we're saying with the scriptures. So it, one of the things that the apostles are famous for is saying, we're not theorists. We're not creating something. We are simply telling the correct ending to a storyline that God put together from the very beginning, i.e. Genesis, from the very origins and creation of the world. God has been putting together a story that has came together in a person by the name of Jesus Christ. And so they are bending over backwards to say, we are not theorists. We are witnesses. We are just telling you what happened. And they encourage people, and here the Bereans are given huge accolades for checking out their references. So it's kind of like that old, Ronald Reagan and the old, Russian Empire. Ronald Reagan was famous for saying, and he's probably not the first to say it, but he was famous for saying, trust with verification. So the apostles don't say, just trust us. We've invented something cool here. No, they say, listen, we're just telling you what the witnesses have, witnessed. And we're not just putting up some sort of philosophical theories. We're not inventing something new. We're just telling you how the story played out. So don't trust us, check in on us. That is their message. And so the Bereans get huge accolades for doing just that. But the Thessalonican Jews are on their tail and kind of flush them out of Berea, and Paul ends up over in Athens. And that's where the story that we're looking at really starts to take some shape. Paul ends up in Athens, and Athens is the philosophical center place of the world. So now we're over in Greece, and Paul starts interacting with people, speaking about Jesus, speaking about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and there are people who are, listening in, and they're happy to listen. In fact, Athens, we are told, is a place where it seems like everybody is happy to hear something new. All the Athenians, we're told, foreigners included, who lived there, spent their time with nothing except telling or hearing something new. So they're very inquisitive people. They don't just simply dismiss people. They just say, hey, tell us more about that. I love that, man. I wish our world was a lot more inquisitive. With all of the modernness of our world, the one thing that we have lost, I think, is our inquiry, that we have lost the spirit of inquiry, checking in, listening to, stuff that might be different than us. Christianity, in the Bible is very comfortable in anybody else's setting. We're not going to find the Apostle Paul appalled, pardon the pun, but appalled at, the religion, the philosophies of the Athenians or anybody else for that matter. He's just there to tell the story, a story that he wants people to listen to, and people are listening, and that's a cool part of what's going on. So Paul is kind of moving in these circles, and there are the classic Greek philosophers, the two groups, the two schools of Greek philosophy, the Epicureans and the Stoics, who are on the scene. And these two groups are kind of always at odds with each other, and they're kind of like the Miller Lite group that, they're just always in this endless battle of taste great, less filling. And so they actually have welcomed, this crazy babbler, as they call Uncle Paul. They say, he seems to be a religious teacher of some sort, preaching foreign gods or, a philosophy. I don't know. He's just a babbler. Let's bring him in. And so they say, come on, come with us. We want you to come to the center place of all philosophical dialogue, and that's the Areopagus, okay? And so the Areopagus is a famous place of philosophical dialogue, blah, 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 blah. And that's where Paul ends up going to. So he's invited, and so the storyline is very good at this point. And it's really, important to see that Paul is happy to accept the, invitation, and Paul is welcomed to say whatever he wants to say. And when it's all said and done, those who believe, what Paul is saying, are accepted, and those who reject what Paul is saying, Paul doesn't cast curses on them. He's not mad at them. He doesn't, say, I'll never talk to you again. He doesn't act like that. Nobody acts like that. Modern people might act like that, but nobody in the Bible acts like that. So we got to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. So Paul ends up standing in the midst of the Areopagus, clearly in the middle of Epicureans and Stoics and all kinds of philosophical backgrounds. And he says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. I've passed along, I've observed the objects of your worship here, which are idols, which are statues, very clear artistic expressions of the gods, as they have, carved them up or, created them. And Paul says, while I was walking, I found this one that you have put together called, a statue to the unknown God. And he says, so what you worship as unknown, that's what I'm going to start talking to you about. Just sheer genius. Just sheer genius. He's meeting them on their level. He says, hey, you've got this here. So let me talk about that, since you just are obviously admitting there's more to what the story might be. And I'll tell you about the unknown God. Okay, so the action really kicks in. Paul then says, what you worship is unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. And he simply says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in temples made by man. Shock, surprise, maybe, I don't know. But he says, nor is he served by human hands as though he needs something. Now, that probably caught them by surprise, because we have a tendency as human beings to think that God or the gods need something from us. It's not a matter of need, Paul says. The God who made the world, he doesn't really need something from us. He offers something to us. Well, okay, let's hear what he says. He says he's not served by human hands as though he needed something, since he himself is the giver to all mankind of life and breath and everything. So God is not a receiver, but a giver. And he made one man from every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined the periods and boundaries of dwelling places of mankind, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from each one of us. Once again, Paul's staying very positive here. He's just saying, hey, listen, the logic of creation is that God made us so that we would actually find him. He didn't make us so that we wouldn't find him. He made us so that we would find him. Paul then quotes their own poets. He said, even your own poets say that in him we live and move and have our beings, and for indeed we are his offspring. So even you all have said things like this. So Paul's saying, I'm not saying anything totally surprising here. And then Paul moves into, he says, being then the offspring of God, we shouldn't be thinking that the divine being is like some sort of gold or silver or stone image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands people everywhere to repent, because he's fixed a day on which he's going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Well, at this news that of the resurrection, some mocked Paul and said, "Ow, come," But others said, "We will hear more about this. This is interesting what you're telling us." And there were some pretty famous people that said, "I'm going to follow up on this. I'm going to keep listening to you, Uncle Paul." And these famous people are Dionysius of the Areopagite and Damaris, a woman. And once again, the Bible is showing us, time and time again, how instrumental and what an important place that the women had in coming to the gospel and becoming the first and part of the basis of Christianity. The women have always had a rock solid place in Christianity as men's equals, coming to Jesus on the same terms, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there you go. There's our passage. Now, I want to double back on, what Paul ends up saying. He says that since then we are God's offspring, we shouldn't be thinking about God like a gold or silver or stone statue formed in the art and imagination of man. Okay, so let's just, stop and pause for a second and realize the environment that Paul is in is the Greco Roman world, which is an Eastern, it's kind of an Eastern, bent to it all. And in the Eastern, bent of philosophy and religion, there are myths and mythologies and polytheism. This is the norm. And Paul is walking into the societal norms of the Greco-Roman world, which has been influenced from the East, as he says that, all mythology is from, and all polytheism is really from the art and imagination of us, mankind. And that's not a bad thing. Paul is not putting them down. He's saying this is not a bad thing because, it's very poetical. The poets get involved in this stuff. It's very thoughtful. Mythology in of itself, polytheism in of itself, it's not bad. It's actually very practical. And when I say it's very practical, I would say that we all need a healthy dose and sympathy for myths and and polytheism. We should be immensely sympathetic towards it because if we're ever to have any sympathy for our brother mankind, then we've got to sympathize with what they're trying to do and understand what they're trying to do. Myths and mythologies and polytheisms, are being a lot more honest than I think most modern people are. Life is scary. We are hurling around on a planet. And even by this time, people knew that we were a planet among planets. And there was a sun and a moon and a great and immense universe that we knew so little about. That's very scary. And then the modern day world finds out that, we are actually traveling around the sun at over 100,000 mile an hour. And while we're, traveling at 100,000 mile an hour, we're spinning at 1,000 mile an hour. This is very scary. And so what the art and imagination of man is doing in polytheism and as well as mythology is just trying to make sense of the world that we're in, because it's very clear we didn't make this place and that we are smaller than something that made this place. And so Paul is not putting them down. He's just trying to give them better information. And I would say that the more sympathetic we are to mythology, one of the things we come to the shocking realization is that the more we realize that myths and things like that were actually never intended to be a religion, like Judaism or Christianity or even Islam. Now that's quite a different thing. Mythologies provided mankind with more of a calendar of festivities and things to do, but mythology never really provided men with creeds, some sort of big statement. You never hear anybody standing up and saying, I believe in Jupiter, Juno, and Neptune, or, I believe in Odin, Thor, and Freya. The mythologies just never worked like that. Polytheism never works like that. Polytheism is exactly as Paul describes it. It is the recognition that there are gods, and among these gods, there's a lot that we don't know, the unknown God. And so, it's also, worth thinking through that, the Jews, they have a creed, that mythology never has. The Jews would say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one." The Christian comes along and says, "I believe in God the Father Almighty," that creed. And even the Mohammedan or the Muslim says there is no God but Allah. Now, these are creeds. These are religions per se, with a definite background or, with a definite aim and objective. And, the old mythologies just didn't work like that. It didn't produce people, Thor people fighting Zeus people. It just didn't go like that. And so the polytheist, is somewhere in the middle of what we typically imagine. The polytheist doesn't disbelieve like an atheist, and the polytheist doesn't believe like a Christian. It's different than that. But mostly, it's all unknown. I mean, that is the background, and that's the background that Paul is talking to. Is that it's the unknown, that humanity is always wrestling with and trying to deal with. And so anyhow, all the gods are unknown gods when push comes to shove. And so when Paul steps into this world, he's actually providing a real break in history for the very, first time, except for the Jews. The Jews also had this break, but, Paul's now entering into the gospel or storyline of God, moving into the whole entire world. And so Paul really does speak of a clear break in history when he declares, without a doubt, who the unknown God is. And when he declares who the unknown God is, it really puts everything into perspective. And this is the logic that Paul has. And so the perspective, let's go on with that. The perspective, that he's, enlightening, so to speak, he's trying to improve upon is the artist, and the temptation of the artist is good intentions. The artist is always full of good intentions, but so I assume. But the temptation of the artist is always or the poet or the dreamer is always to imagine things from the perspective of absence, not from the perspective of presence. The polytheists and the myths, they could only be imagined as high as Mount Olympus. You see what I'm saying? The imagination of the artist or the poet or the dreamer was always limited to some sort of mountaintop, and no further than that, which still puts it all here on earth. But compare that to Moses. And Moses, who, had a moment with God where God condescended from heaven, not a mountain, but from heaven, condescended and showed Moses only his backside. And it was Moses who heard him say that he was gracious and compassionate and slow of anger and mindful of everyone and everything. Whereas Mount Olympus, and everything that always came from the top of a mountain through way of the poet and the artist, etc., never spoke of God as gracious and compassionate. It took the presence of God, not the absence of God. So when God is absent in our thinking, we don't end up imagining him as being gracious and compassionate. Whereas when we have the presence of God, our imagination becomes more real and it becomes more helpful, because Moses was speaking from the presence of God whenever he said that God said personally that he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and mindful of everyone everywhere. Jesus himself also spoke from presence, not absence. And Paul is speaking from presence, not absence. And that is, that brings you to different places. Once again, the apostles and the prophets prior to that never spoke of God from the perspective of absence, but spoke of God from the perspective of God's presence. And that changes things. And then there's the philosophers themselves that Paul is, talking to, but he's also talking to the artists and the dreamers. They're all kind of bundled into, a group of people who are thinking, and they're good thinkers. They're trying to think things through, but Paul is trying to enlighten them, to get them to think something clearly and radically different. So the temptation of the philosopher is to always be attracted by oversimplifications and to dismiss subtlety and paradox, things like that. Philosophy, as it comes from the East, is usually reduced to a circle, a serpent, biting in on its tail. And that represents, unity and reoccurrence. And that's okay, I guess. But really, it includes everything, but it's, really getting nowhere because it's just a circle. And in the end, the argument tends to be pointless because it's always circular and it never really gets to go anywhere. Even the swastika, which Germany had borrowed from the East, that they didn't make that thing up, is these lines that come out and they bend at a right angle, and when they do that, they form a wheel, which once again has its, form as a wheel that once again is just going round and round, and it doesn't really get anywhere. It doesn't have an end. It doesn't have a beginning. It shows unity. It shows recurrence, but it's not really going anywhere. It's the cross of Jesus Christ, the cross, as a new symbol that Paul is speaking to. And that is that the cross of God, the cross of Jesus Christ, is truly different and it's truly remarkable because it breaks out of the circle of the Eastern philosophies and the Eastern arts and imaginations that come from them. It breaks out of that circle and it declares that there is a beginning and that there is an end. The cross not only sees the perspective of the heavens, but it also comes down to earth to declare the presence of God. The cross is going somewhere. It has a connective point, from point A to point B. And it comes down from the heavens more like a staircase, more like a way to travel. And that sets it up as radically different. And so, when Paul speaks to Greeks and Gentiles, he always starts from creation because from a Greek philosophy and from a Gentile philosophy, they need the starting place of creation and the logic of creation. And the logic of creation is exactly what Paul says, that there is a God who created everything. And the God who created everything also created us. And all of those ethnicities and all of those nations that we put so much stock into, those are actually all under God. And their origins are with God as well. Their origin is with the same ancestry.com. It all goes back to God's original people. And all of our stories go back to God's original people. And so that's the logic that, God is Uncle Paul is calling them to think about, is that there is a definitive beginning. And then Paul drops in, and now we know that there is an end. Now, Paul doesn't say when the end is. He just says, now we know that there is also an end. And this is really, I find that most Christians, kind of miss this point that all of the apostles were making. And the book of Acts, points this out time and time again. The apostles preached the resurrection even more so than they preached the cross, because the logic of the resurrection, as Uncle Paul says, to the group, is now there is also an end. The end is now fixed because the guy who rose from the dead is clearly the guy and clearly is God who will judge all things, and there will be an end. So Paul, once again, is not putting us on some sort of weird hunt for when the end would be. It's just the knowledge that there is an end. There is a beginning and there is an end. That is where Uncle Paul's taking the audience. He's saying the resurrection of Jesus Christ, when Rome and the Jews, killed Jesus outside of Jerusalem on a town garbage heap, and then he rose again. We are witnesses to this. We're not theorizing anything. We're just witnesses to this event, and we are just telling you what has been seen and the logic of what has been seen. And the logic of the resurrection is that Jesus Christ is the judge who will judge the world and bring an end of the world the way we understand the world. The God who made the world will indeed bring an end to the world that we know and understand. And it's not bad news. It's just big news, because that calls us all to get a little bit more serious about the message. And that's what Paul's saying. It's time for everybody to repent. I mean, turn away from everything that you thought you knew and come to this, because this is the good stuff. And the audiences are responding very positively to this. They're saying, you're right. Having a beginning and an end is definitely more hopeful and more exciting than a circle that has no end. Well, let's think about that. Go back and reread it for yourself, just as Paul would tell tell us all to do. Check it out for yourselves, and we'll catch you next time.